you can start, Grant, that you have the only point at the moment in the agenda.
Great, yeah, and yeah, hopefully there are no issues. I'm traveling and got stuck without a flight, so I'm borrowing a computer. So bear with me. Not used to his computer or anything. So yeah, I wanted to raise a topic on REST versus GraphQL, really just kind of bringing it back to the forefront from our earlier meetings. We wanted to go out, get some feedback through user surveys, customer interviews, and the like, and start trying to make some decisions on this. So we've been collecting data in the user survey. We've had 553 responses in total now, which I think is awesome. Seems like a really significant feedback. And yeah, I guess what kind of sparred this a little bit is Victor, you shared, I think you're on the call, you had shared some feedback from our Terraform provider, I think it was, or Python maintainer. Oh no, Terraform provider, that's right. And they're pretty much just asking for guidance. Have we made any progress? Do we know what direction we're going? Are we going to be more heavily supporting GraphQL and getting consistency in GraphQL or REST? And then also there's a question there, I think a little bit more about how do I know, what's changing specifically in terms of APIs? Like, I think that, there are the pages that we share around deprecations and everything, but, I don't think it's really narrowly broken down specifically on the API endpoints or builds is the sense that I got, or that it's maybe not easy for them to identify. So what I wanted to do is just share a little bit of the data that I've captured so far, and then open it up for discussion and see if there's some opportunities to kind of get either policies or priority on things for the major milestone coming up. Because once that passes, then we'll have to wait a pretty significant period, another year, before we can get any changes in there. Okay, so let me share my screen. And you should be able to see REST versus GraphQL discussion. Is that the right screen?
Yeah.
Oops, that's not one. That's one. And so this is pretty sparse right now. I'm still need to go through in more detail through the data. But the first first chart here is just around the question: do you have a preference in API format? 251 of the 553 people that responded to the survey answered this question, and what we see is there's an overwhelming preference. Well, really, there's an overwhelming preference in neither. There's not a preference in 45%, but between REST and GraphQL, 41% prefer REST based on those who responded.
Sorry, may I add a word here? Because
yes.
I interpret these results very differently, actually.
Okay.
The overall numbers. Then what I see is that out of the 251 people, around 210 would be happy with REST, and 140 would be happy with GraphQL. So it's not a clear winner that there is no preference. I would say that actually there's a clear winner that.
Correct. No preference is they'd be happy with either.
But they have to pick one. So I mean,
yeah.
And then the question is, which one do we support? Which one do we put forward?
Right. So it's kind of, I guess one way I read that is, it's almost like if we can total up no preference plus GraphQL and then no preference plus REST.
Yeah.
Which is the winner between those two. One thing I did do, and I haven't gone through and segmented all this in a lot of different ways, but I have been really curious about the large customer segment. So I broke it down by large customer responses, and note that of the 251, only 19 identified themselves as large customers. So that's a fairly small number, but based on the survey data, that preference jumped up quite a bit on the REST, and over no preference. And so far the interviews I've had, which, I want to have many more, but large customers seem to be identifying that they do prefer REST over GraphQL. And only a couple more slides here. I wanted to pull out some of the feedback for when users do prefer REST or GraphQL, why. And overwhelmingly, the top response around REST was familiarity. Some folks are saying, I'm just more familiar. Others are saying, I just don't know GraphQL, don't want to invest the time. And it's not like these are necessarily in order. Like that was many responses around that first item. Some of these are just one response or two that were related to the bullet, but easier to debug using Python scripts, easier to use REST from CLI, more consistent support across vendors. I thought was interesting, just kind of saying this is the more popular standard across SaaS platforms and SaaS products. So, it makes sense to use that. There may be some kind of company policy that this is just what my company or employer uses for building apps. There's also kind of the tooling around it, the support for packages and libraries, easier to build into custom tooling, simple shell scripts. This one's kind of it's kind of a challenge. GitLab specifically, some endpoints aren't available in GraphQL. So maybe if they were, it would bring those customers over to maybe preferring GraphQL. And then the last one is I've seen a couple times too, have to convince management that we want to, use GraphQL, and that's an effort. But with REST, it's kind of just common standard and there's less effort there. So a lot of people did give responses to this follow-up question if they chose REST as their preference. Not as many responses of why they would prefer GraphQL when they chose that. So the responses here were why GraphQL types and complex requests. They're all pretty similar. The ability to create precise complex queries, so reducing overfetching or underfetching, and then fine-grained access. So I think these were all pretty similar responses. And this quote, I don't know if it's word for word, but it's something I took away from one of the interviews that I had, is I think especially for those that no preference group, is just like, if you can just pick one of these and go with it, we can at least know what to expect and plan around that. And I think that's just saying, GitLab, if you can be consistent in offering one of these APIs and supporting it really well, that's going to help us. And I think that they would all, this is my own assumption here, but I think they would all get value out of having support for both APIs, but we just need to pick one first and make sure that it's very fleshed out, well documented, we have tooling around it, well supported, and then we can add value with the secondary API for specific use cases.
So one question here. I know that this is kind of an early question for the stage where we are at, and I don't expect you to have an answer, but I love this, first of all. So this is an amazing quote. Thank you very much. And thanks for all that you are showing us here. Does this direction that we pick one and go with it will mean that slowly we would roll out the other one?
From where I'm standing, I'm making a lot of assumptions and want to learn from you guys who have a lot of experience and have been here longer. But I would like to see us, like I said, build out more robust support around one, just making sure that every feature is supported that we possibly can, and then work on making it easier to then add the feature to the secondary API. Like if there was tooling that allows us to say add our features first into REST, and then makes it easier to come back and add a GraphQL field that's parity with that feature. that's kind of the way I would see that. Or if we, for whatever reason, chose GraphQL, but just based on the data, I feel like there is, from a customer standpoint, of course, I understand that internally, maybe for front end purposes, GraphQL is preferred, but it seems like for our customers, REST endpoints, having those available is largely the preference here.
Thanks.
But that said, I think I want to open it up from here. The big question, I think, is knowing that we have 15.0 coming up, and with this type of data so far that we have, what does that mean? And I don't have those answers. I just wanted to start with a discussion, but maybe we can be thinking about, what can we do, even if it's just marginal, iterative improvements that help chip away at some of the challenges our customers are having.
One thing that strikes me is the list of reasons why I prefer REST. All those things are actionable, and we could easily turn them into things we wanted to address. So just off the top of my head, you mentioned there that better command line support, better Python support. Could we include ways of automatically constructing a curl invocation for both REST and GraphQL, so people can see those things? I mean, not trying to lead them down towards one or the other. People's support preferences are valid, but if we're trying to help people see that which tasks are easy and doable on the command line, we could perhaps do something to address those needs. I think the list of reasons why people prefer REST or prefer GraphQL can also be seen as a set of things that people want, and that would be very helpful to work towards. Some of that's documentation, some of it's working on our developer docs, so a bit more code, but I think we could improve on those different dimensions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think absolutely, we can. I think ultimately we're saying we don't want to. When it's not, we're going to say we're not going to continue focusing on GraphQL in any way. I think it's just a matter of where we start. And I think the biggest challenge to overcome is consistency, is what I'm hearing. So there are features that are in GraphQL and not in REST. So is that, for example, something we could start with, make sure that we do have everything in REST first. Then also, let's chip away at the challenges that were cited there for why they use REST, which it does seem like an education thing. I think we're seeing a lot of value or reasons to use GraphQL over REST, but they, apparently don't see that.
Well, I don't want to make it be seen like I'm educating people towards my preference. That's not the case. But yeah. I mean, it's more about, we have some resources that exist. We want to educate people how to use them. But I think your point about helping people by having an overview of the resources that are available, and then plugging the gaps first would be a very good way to approach 15.0, to make sure that if there's anything missing on the REST side, fix that first. If there's anything missing on the GraphQL side, obviously, if that's not people's preference, queue that for later.
Great.
Cool. I would argue to have GraphQL first to pitch that. And I know that I'm doing that against the data that we have today. But so in a sense, I'm saying that probably what I'm saying needs more research. But what I see is that many of the arguments around REST are around current culture, which is almost impossible to change, but we could solve it with solutions that Alex just said. And the flexibility of GraphQL is something that we cannot solve with REST. So, and I think that we need that flexibility sooner or later anyway. We need it for the GitLab UI. And if we pick one above the other, it will only work if the whole GitLab engineering starts to follow that, which means that the front end will start to follow that in large as well, and so on. So it should have a cascading effect throughout GitLab. And I'm worried that with REST, we won't have that buy-in from GitLab itself. And I was super happy with what you said, Alex, before, because without that, I would have argued for REST. So what I would say is that we should look at all the critiques, well, not critiques, all the benefit, why people favor REST over GraphQL, and see what our answers would be if we go with GraphQL, and put like 10 minutes of thinking to each of that. And perhaps on a few interviews with people who are favoring REST to really dig deep into that question, like, okay, what's behind your arguments for REST? What was there really?
And I would also add to that, I think the other argument, in order to still wanting to put some emphasis on GraphQL, not just for own needs, but you mentioned, Grant, about implementing one in terms of the other, and you can implement REST in terms of GraphQL, but you can't do that. You can't have a bunch of REST endpoints that you then use to implement GraphQL. You can't do that efficiently. So in terms of if you have to choose one to implement the other, it would have to go in that direction. Accepting streaming stuff and some things which are truly impossible to do in GraphQL, which was mentioned on previous occasions.
Yeah, I think those are very good points. I think that at the moment we have the idea here at GitLab that is GraphQL first, but I'm not sure if, like, how far are we with that idea, because I don't see like we are approaching that strategy consistently and thinking like, okay, in 5 years time, let's say that we only support GraphQL, so we are not on following that. So I think that if we understand what are the main points to prefer REST, maybe we can understand what we have to do in order to take any long-term direction. I'm not sure if, because at the end we have to choose one or the other, right? Is what I understand. And at the end, what we want is just go with one approach, because otherwise it's going to be more work on us all the time. And there are other problems like the parity between REST and GraphQL. And if you develop something, maybe you only need that, for example, for the front end only on GraphQL, and you are not supporting REST. So I think at some point we have to decide and then commit into one strategy and make a path in order to move with that strategy, and with clear due dates, or at this point is going to happen something, at this point is going to happen something. And it could be very long-term plan, but I think that at the end, I think we have to choose one of these, right?
Questions to you, Brian.
Questions to who?
To you, I guess.
Well, I think I was going to pause and say I want to hear everyone else's thoughts on that. I think that's a really good question. I mean, my initial thinking is I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I mean, I'm sure it would be more support, but I think we need to understand, how do we quantify that? What is needed, and is it critical to support both? I mean, based on the feedback that I'm seeing, I wonder if we can overcome some of the challenges that we have with you know, the education, the familiarity, like how common the REST standard is. But you know, what would be the impact of say doing GraphQL only supporting GraphQL? I think that's yet to be quantified. But maybe, you know, I don't know, we're talking about long term, but I want to hear from the technical experts on the call as well.
Alex, if you want to go first.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I think it would be good to get a resource level analysis of what our gaps are. Missing features on this should be analyzed on a per group basis. So what does source code, what does code review have, what does integrations have, and REST GraphQL. That each group would be the most equipped to provide that information, and that would be a really helpful starting point for this discussion in terms of what's available. And if we talk about there are lots of things that are available on one side or the other, but I don't think we're talking concrete terms about what those things are, what the biggest gaps are, what the most painful gaps are. So, and which things we will never fill. So for, I mentioned above CI traces will never be provided for GraphQL because of the nature of the resource. So I think that level, where would I want to go next is if missing features between each level is important for your customers, and it obviously is, this level of analysis, that's one I'd like to see done. This would require buy-in from each group because each group would have to be involved.
So listing, so gap analysis per group, list each of the features. What do we have in REST? What do we have in GraphQL? And then what can only be in REST, for example, or what could only be in GraphQL?
Precisely, yeah. So, for example, merge requests. Can you do everything in merge requests in REST? Can you do it all in GraphQL? Which features are?
Okay. Then I'll try to answer a question from a non-technical point of view. Oh, yeah, he's back. You're back, Alex. We lost you.
You kind of froze on us a little bit, Alex.
Oh, I was just saying, yes, I was agreeing with you and emphasizing that I think this needs to be broken down by product category.
Product category, right.
I would go back a bit to Arturo's comments, and because I think that we can actually make whatever direction we take, we can make this a priority for the product teams to fill the gap. If there is a clear direction from you, Grant, from your team. So that, especially if you can put besides that an investment case, then that shows that this is the money that we spend today on maintaining both. This would be if you can just focus on one of them. This is the expected speed boost or whatever that we gain from it, and then it should be totally. I think it's totally realistically that it might be done in a year or year and a half to have full coverage for one of the APIs, full coverage based on the limitations of the given API, of course.
Another thing that is not technical is that we are going to face all the time like people pushing back. So it doesn't matter like what is the approach that you select. You are going to have like, hey, I have a customer with 500 or 5,000 seats that wants to continue with this path. So, or even internally, maybe there are things, maybe we can start like trying to pitch in this internally, like, hey, what happens if we go just with GraphQL, for example, and we can see internally what are the problems that we are having before, like, you know, like if we just say, let's go with this, what is going to happen just inside GitLab? you know.
Hasn't the internal debate mostly taken place? Front-end development is entirely GraphQL based these days. Would anyone from front-end like to speak to that? I think there's not much debate anymore, is there?
We're not completely GraphQL based, but we aim to use GraphQL API anywhere, whenever it's possible, because we have this is like moving to Vue and Apollo everywhere. And we have proven track records that it makes things easier, especially things like labels or assignees on GraphQL. So yep, frontend is mostly interested in GraphQL these days, if we have the GraphQL endpoint and resource. Sometimes we don't.
I remember we had this in the documentation at some point that we wanted to use the REST API as a wrapper for GraphQL. So every REST API endpoint would in the background call a GraphQL endpoint to, and then basically just pretend it's REST, but in the background it's GraphQL. And maybe this could be a path for, yeah, customers that really want to use REST. We could maybe provide a wrapper for them to use REST, but GraphQL to make the adoption easier. But yeah, I think we have to figure out the overhead of this thing and if it's really worth doing it.
So that makes sense in the case that we have some REST endpoints today that are missing to maybe do an experiment.
Well, yeah, that would be a nice idea. If we find something that we have in GraphQL but not in REST, we could definitely add a REST endpoint that uses the GraphQL in the background.
Great. Well, I think this has been good discussion. I know we're kind of closing in on time here. I don't know if any decisions are, of course, made, and I think there's a lot of follow-up to be done internally and externally. But any final points?
I would like to share something here, because all of this started from the comment that I had on GitHub. But I would write back there that the provider is likely better off if it starts to move from REST to GraphQL. Based on discussion we had, this is my impression. I don't know if you agree with this. So it's not a very strong saying that that's the direction we are going, but my impression is that we are slowly converging towards that we want GraphQL first.
Yeah, that's been my impression since starting with GitLab, and what I think of, what I have been sharing with customers. That way, there seems to be a slight preference in direction there. I think it's just trying to understand how do we get back to REST, or what is our policy with REST in the short term. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. It sounds like, internally especially, there's a strong preference for GraphQL. I think there's just this clear discrepancy between our internal preference and especially larger customers, and they're kind of stuck in their ways with REST, I think. So how do we solve for that? But that doesn't mean using REST first necessarily. That may not be the right way to attack that problem.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'm happy to respond in that issue.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, see you.
Yep, thank you. Feel free to share more comments in the doc if you didn't get a chance. Have a good week. Bye.